All right, welcome to lecture number 4. This is the first part of the carbohydrate section. We are, as been sort of par for the course the last couple lectures, we're splitting this one in half. Makes for a little bit better, more manageable file size on the blackboard. So uh, in this lecture, we're finally now getting to talking about sort of more nutrition stuff, right? We've covered digestion, which obviously is nutrition related, and metabolism, which is very much related as well, but we haven't talked about food. Haven't talked about necessarily what we're putting in our body specifically, right? Other than the digestion stuff, which was a discussion about what happens. So with this talk, we're going to finally start talking about food, get into carbohydrates, one of our primary macronutrients. Some of the learning outcomes are here. Yeah, basic structures of carbs, of course. Explain their function. Yep, we're going to cover that in some detail. Distinguish between poor and good choices of carbohydrate foods. I don't come up with the eat this, not that, or vice versa list. But we do discuss, and I think the dark side of fat loss does a much better job than I do. What would be a reasonable or a good choice of carbohydrate food versus not so good. And then we'll get into finishing the discussion. That'll be in part 2 of the role of carbohydrates for training and competition. Lots of good stuff to cover in this lecture, so let's get to it. Carbohydrates are definitely not the enemy, sort of, I like to put. I think in the media over the past, over the decades, I'd say carbohydrates have gotten beat up pretty good, right? And I'd say right now we're going through a phase of, carbs are the enemy, right? It carbohydrates that you're eating to make you fat. Well, we covered some of that in the digestive talk, right? We talked about how, eating carbs doesn't straight directly make you fat, but eating carbs does dull fat metabolism. It does make it more likely that we're going to store fat that we consume as fat. So carbs can be the enemy in many ways, and we'll get into that in this discussion. But that being said, carbs are really important for a lot of things. And so they are the primary fuel source for most cells in our body that need fuel. So our brain loves carbohydrates, loves sugar, and your muscles love to use it for an energy source as well. So carbohydrates play that role of being sort of that gasoline for our body. And we often use that analogy. Oh yeah, carbs are like gasoline, right? You fill that tank up with gas, or muscles, and you're going to be able to exercise well. The glucose and glycogen are our storage form of carbohydrates. So once we consume them, again, this is getting back to our digestion lecture. But once carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, what is their fate? Well, they get stored as glycogen, either in the muscle or in the liver. And they stay as glycogen there, waiting to be used as an energy source ultimately. Our storage capacity of carbohydrates is quite limited. And we'll get into this, especially towards the end of the second part of this lecture. How long can we exercise reasonably without supplementing carbohydrates? Most, even top-level athletes exercising at their sort of race pace or competitive intensity, we're talking about 2 hours worth of energy before you run out enough to affect performance. And that's usually less time for most people. So we're talking, in the duration of a marathon, which takes most people well over 2 hours to complete, we can definitely run out of carbohydrates. And so supplying the body with carbohydrates for exercise purposes becomes a challenge and becomes really important for success in certain types of performances. And we'll get into that in detail later. Carbohydrates are synthesized by plants. There are some carbohydrates found in animal products. We find lactose in dairy products. We find a little bit of glycogen in meat products, but that's just the leftover glycogen that's been stored in that animal's muscle. And so the carbohydrates generally, though, especially in larger amounts, we do find them synthesized by plants. And so we find them in plant products. There's 3 sort of main categories of carbohydrates: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. There's a 4th in there that I should have included: oligosaccharides. They fall in between the disaccharide and polysaccharide category. I'll define those in a minute, so don't worry that I haven't defined them yet. Let's first talk about the sources of carbohydrates in our food supply. So generally speaking, if we're looking at foods that are really high in carbohydrates in terms of relative terms, amount of energy coming from carbohydrates, grain products, so we're looking at your breads, your pastas, your cereals, extremely high in carbohydrates. Naturally, yes. And then, of course, what we love to do to our food is just add sugar to them. And so we will find lots of added sugar in grain products all over the place. Um, Vegetables are very high in carbohydrates. Vegetables will have a balance and they'll have some protein in them, and some will have fat in them as well, as do grains. But yes, vegetables are typically mostly carbohydrates. They're so low in energy, calories, that they're not considered a good source of carbohydrates necessarily. Although, if you look at something like the starchy vegetables, like potatoes, those are carbohydrate powerhouses. Fruits as well are high in carbohydrates. Most fruits are also sort of carbohydrate or even sugar bombs, depending on the fruit itself and how it's prepared. And so we do get a lot of benefits from consuming fruits and vegetables. They come with a lot of vitamins and minerals. They come with also with fiber as well. So consuming, getting our carbohydrates from fruits and vegetables is a good way to go. Dairy products, like mentioned earlier, we find lactose in dairy products. That's the dairy sugar or milk sugar. Beans, a legume, which is technically also a vegetable, I guess. Depends on how you look at it. Beans are quite high in carbohydrates. A lot of people consider beans a protein food. They're high in protein as well, but it's about a 3-to-1 ratio, give or take, for most beans, meaning for every 3 grams of carbohydrates, you'll find about 1 gram of protein. So technically, I would call that more of a carbohydrate food. And then, yes, in terms of sources of carbohydrates in our food supply, we, as people who live in America, we eat tons of sugar. And I'll talk very briefly about sugar later. Sean does a good job on the dark side mentioning sugar and why we probably should be avoiding it. It's kind of one of those no-brainers, almost in the level of, why you shouldn't smoke cigarettes. It's getting to that point where it's like, eating tons of excess sugar isn't probably the best choice. So at least there's our carbohydrate sources from our food supply. Most of you probably already familiar with those. All right, what do carbohydrates do for us in terms of their function? Generally, they're considered by a lot of people kind of a one-trick pony. Carbohydrates provide our cells with energy, and that's really their most important function. That's why we highlight that one in red. They do some other things more as side effects, but they're important things. One thing is when carbohydrate status is adequate. So when our body has carbohydrates, it has an effect of protein sparing. And when we talk about protein sparing, this is an effect of carbohydrates preventing us from using protein as an energy source. So we can break protein down, we can break our muscles down and actually form a couple of things. First, we can break proteins down and form new sugar from them. That's a process called gluconeogenesis. Our body does that. And when we're low on carbohydrate status, either we don't eat very many carbohydrates or we've been exercising so long that we're just out of carbohydrates, this gluconeogenesis, breaking down proteins for carbohydrates, that rate will go up quite a bit. And so, carbohydrate status will help us spare protein. It will also prevent a condition called ketosis. And ketosis we'll get into in more detail in the fat discussion, but ketosis generally is a condition where an individual is using fat metabolism at such a high rate that we have the development of what are called ketone bodies, the production of ketone bodies at a very high rate. Ketone bodies are essentially, again, this is a shortcut for now, are 2 acetyl-CoA molecules joined together. Fat molecule gets broken down, it goes through beta oxidation, and then ultimately to form a whole bunch of acetyl-CoAs. Those acetyl-CoAs start to build up, they form together, just 2 acetyl-CoAs together, forms a ketone body. If we have carbohydrates present, ketosis will not occur. The reason is not because we can't break down fat, but when carbohydrates are present, like you already know, fat breakdown, fat metabolism slows down or stops, and therefore ketones won't be produced. So it takes about, in most individuals, and this is a give or take, of course, but in the neighborhood of about 50 grams a day of carbohydrates to avoid being in a state of ketosis. Carbohydrates also provide sweetness to the taste of food. That's important. We want food to taste good. Sometimes we had so much sugar that it almost tastes too good. So, and probably in what, the energy supply is definitely key. These other bullets, sort of secondary, but fiber is another really important sort of aspect of carbohydrates. Fiber is a carbohydrate product, but it is quite unique and doesn't have the same sort of nutritional value or properties as other carbohydrates do. We'll talk about fiber in a minute here. Okay, so carbohydrate intake. Before we start defining the different types of carbohydrates, how much carbohydrate should we be consuming? This is a ridiculously controversial issue. Probably my favorite chapter in The Dark Side of Fat Loss is chapter 3, Do What Healthy People Do. Why is that? Because it addresses this issue with sort of historical examples and cultures. Is there the perfect amount of carbohydrates for people to eat? No. People can thrive on eating no carbohydrates. People can thrive on eating a diet that's 60, 70, 80% carbohydrates. Ultimately, it does come down to what's available and natural and sort of in season in your environment. And if we stick to those types of guidelines for the foods that we choose, carbohydrate intake, there is no one size fits all. There isn't with any of this. So it is a controversial issue. Ranges do go from 0 to 80% for some recommendations. It really depends on the individual, what some of their goals might be, what their activity level is, maybe their health status, that kind of stuff. The recommendation is pretty, I use the term vanilla, right? It's like kind of like 40 to 60% of total daily calories. Sure, people can be okay with that. People, like I said, people can be better with more or less. So one of the keys with carbohydrate consumption is less associated with how much carbohydrates, and more associated with the type. And so one of the most important keys is to minimize the highly processed, highly refined carbohydrates. We're talking, your white flours and white grain products, so your white rices, your white breads, your white pastas, added sugar to anything. Those are the types of carbohydrates that tend to cause, or that will potentially cause, greater concerns regarding weight balance or weight management and health. And so we find that individuals who overconsume those highly processed carbohydrates, which also usually goes hand in hand with highly processed fats and proteins, but too much consumption of those highly processed carbohydrates is a bigger concern than how much carbohydrates you actually eat. And so hopefully through this discussion, and especially through the dark side, chapter 3, those issues will become a little bit more clear. Recommendations for carbohydrate intake, they vary. And so in my work with counseling athletes, it really depends. Even within a specific sport, I may have an athlete who plays one position eat a lot more carbohydrates based on that position and the activity for that position and the training involved versus an athlete on the same team in a different position, right? As an example, a goalkeeper on a soccer team versus a midfielder on a soccer team. I have the midfielders eating a heck of a lot more carbohydrates. They're burning through, right? Midfielders are running up to 10K. They're doing like 6+ miles in a game. Is a goalie running that much during a game? I hope not. Shouldn't be if you're a goalie. Something's not right if you're running that much. So goalkeepers, in terms of their need for energy, different place. And so recommendations do vary based on an individual's activity level, based on their needs, and then even on a daily basis, right? And I counsel a lot of athletes who will have phases of the season, which makes sense, right? Hey, during certain times of the season, they're not doing much. They're just trying to maintain, a little less carbs. Hey, they're trying to grow. We increase the carbs. So there is some flexibility in carbohydrate intake, without a doubt. All right, so let's talk about the structure, the basics of carbohydrates. So the classification of carbohydrates, we abbreviate them CHO. We have simple carbohydrates and then the complex carbohydrates. And the simple carbohydrates include two categories, monosaccharides and disaccharides. Monosaccharides are carbohydrates, most simple version. That's a one molecule carbohydrate. There's 3 monosaccharides. We'll talk about them in a second. And then there's also disaccharides, and that's 2 carbohydrate molecules linked together. Those are also considered simple carbohydrates. Both of those, if consumed, are quite sweet to taste. The more simple or the smaller the carbohydrate, the less number of carbohydrate molecules in a compound, the sweeter it'll taste. So the simple carbohydrates are basically sweets. And like sucrose, which is table sugar, that's a disaccharide, which we'll talk about in a second. The complex carbohydrates, these are bigger carbohydrate molecules, and then there's 2 categories within that. There's oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. Oligosaccharides are of anywhere from 3 to 10 carbohydrate molecules joined together. polysaccharides is above 10, but gets into the thousands. So we're looking at really big starchy molecules, that kind of stuff. So the complex carbohydrates are, again, more starchy in nature. They don't taste as sweet. Potato is a great example of food full of polysaccharides, full of starch. And the difference between the simple and complex are noteworthy. We'll talk about them because they do affect us differently when we consume them. Don't worry too much about this, but it's a nice sort of family tree, so to speak, a carbohydrate family tree, where we have, carbohydrates at the top there. It's sectioned off into simple and complex carbohydrates. And if we're looking at the left side of the screen, the simple carbohydrates have the monosaccharides, the 3 monosaccharides, and I'm operating right here in the sort of middle left side of the screen. Our 3 monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. And I want to mention something here. Every sugar, every carbohydrate that we consume is made up of a combination of those 3 monosaccharides. So these are the building blocks for bigger sugars: glucose, fructose, galactose. The next category over here to the right, the disaccharides, these are 2 sugar units. We have lactose, which is a glucose and a galactose molecule joined together. It's basically your dairy sugar. We have sucrose. This is your table sugar, and that's a glucose joined with a fructose. So that's your table sugar, right? White sugar. And then maltose, which is our, I'd say, 3rd most common disaccharide. Maltose is 2 glucoses joined together. And there's also trehalose, which is also 2 glucoses joined together. These 3, lactose, sucrose, and maltose, are the 3 I'll ask you about on any exams or quizzes. So those are our disaccharides. The oligosaccharides, I'm not going to get into details of their names. You won't be tested on them. 3 to 10 sugar units. Typically just glucose, but some do have galactose and fructose in them. And then we have our polysaccharides. And our polysaccharides are massive molecules of carbohydrates, many sugars or monosaccharides joined together, and they're always glucose. And so we have these massive chains of glucose, starch, and glycogen. We'll talk about amylose and amylopectin in just a second. Those are 2 other categories that actually aren't on this list. So again, the nitty-gritty details of this graphic, not so much, but know those monosaccharides, know the disaccharides, know the definition of oligo and polysaccharide for sure. So from the previous slide graphic, this is just a little bit more detail. There's your glucose, your fructose, and your galactose, our monosaccharides. You'll notice fructose does stand out a little bit differently in its chemical structure. Instead of being a 6-ringed structure or 6-carbon ring structure, this is a 5-carbon ring. So this is a pentose versus a hexose, right? And so fructose is unique in that way, and that's one of the reasons that fructose, when we consume it, it needs to get transported over to the liver and get converted to glucose, then we can use glucose. Galactose is actually very, very similar to glucose. It does not need to be sent to the liver to get converted to glucose. I think it's just a matter of flipping the conformation of the hydrogen and oxygen on this carbon. Very, very small adjustment. So those are our monosaccharides. Again, our list of our disaccharides here: sucrose, lactose, maltose. A graphic that shows you the disaccharides. This might be overkill, but be familiar with the disaccharides. It's pretty easy stuff. Lactose, maltose, sucrose, there they are. Even gives a little information on where you find them. Yeah, lactose, also called milk sugar. Maltose, we find these in fermented products, things like beer. And then we have sucrose, which is table sugar, basically. Honey is pretty much all sucrose. All right, so our polysaccharides, I'm skipping forward to them. We'll get to the oligosaccharides in a second. Polysaccharides, we have starch and glycogen. Glycogen is that storage form of carbohydrate. We don't find it in our food other than eating the flesh of other animals, right? So we're eating muscles of other animals, there's glycogen stored in their muscles, that's where we'll get it. So pretty much a primary, and there's not much in it, right? You eat a piece of chicken, there may be a gram of glycogen in a chicken breast, and if that. So it's very, very low very, very low in glycogen. So our main source of getting polysaccharides into our body come through starch. And starch is what's formed or made in plants. And so these polysaccharides, generally, we're looking in the 3,000 plus range of bound monosaccharides, bound glucoses. There's two different forms of starch, amylose and amylopectin. There's a graphic on the next slide that talks about them. Amylose is a straight chain of glucoses. There's no branches, no nothing. It just starts with the glucose and just one glucose joined to the next all the way to the end. The amylopectin is also a chain of glucoses, but there's branches. So you have this, a couple glucoses joined together, and then there's like an intersection, like a split. And then the chains continue, and then they keep splitting. And so all of a sudden we have this molecule of amylopectin that is all branched out and has multiple ends, where the amylose just has two ends. It's just a straight chain. Dietary fiber is considered a polysaccharide. It's indigestible. We'll talk about fiber in a few minutes in terms of its properties and how it stands out differently from the rest. So on this slide, we have amylose and we have amylopectin. And so I just wanted to highlight that, amylose is just a straight chain, even though I know it's bent, but it's not a branched chain. So we start with the glucose here, and it's just glucose is joined together, and then there's another the end of it is there. Amylopectin, as an example, right? We have a chain here, we have another chain here, another chain here, another chain here. It's branched, right? So there's multiple ends. What's important, what I want you to take from the difference between these when we consume foods high in either amylose or amylopectin is this. When we consume foods high in amylose, the enzymes, the amylases, right? And that's how we name the enzymes. And actually getting back to our sucrose, lactose, and maltose, the enzymes that break down sucrose, sucrase, lactose, lactase, and maltose, maltase. So the enzymes in our body that are designed to break down specific carbohydrates basically take the beginning of the name of the carbohydrate and add an ASE at the end. So amylases break down these long chains of carbohydrates. And so an amylase enzyme can only work on the ends of the molecule. And so if we eat a food high in amylose, the amylase can only work on this end and this end to break off those glucose molecules. So think about it. If you ate a food high in amylose, how would it affect your blood sugar? Would it affect glucose levels in your blood to go up real quickly? Because in the intestines, the amylase is liberating a whole bunch of glucose at once. Or would it affect blood sugar slowly because there's a very slow release of glucoses in the intestines that allow the glucose to transport across the membrane into blood? It's the second one, right? There's going to be a very slow release of glucose because there's only two ends to work on. Conversely, if we consume a food high in amylopectin, there's multiple ends for the amylases to work on, and therefore in the small intestine where the amylase is starting to do its thing, it's going to start liberating multiple glucoses at once, and therefore our blood sugar response is going to be much greater. And so we find foods high in amylose. These are starches that aren't sweet. We don't find them naturally, we find amylose often quite in a lot of foods naturally, right? So in unprocessed grains, raw potatoes, unripe bananas, that kind of stuff. We find amylopectin quite often in sweeter foods, naturally sweeter foods. Ripe fruit tends to be high in amylopectin. Cooked or hot potatoes, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, are also high in amylopectin. We'll get into the details of that. So foods high in amylopectin, higher blood sugar response. High in amylose, lower blood sugar response. All right. The oligosaccharides. The oligosaccharides are in that in-between category, right? Not simple, not the mono or disaccharide, but they're not massive like the polysaccharides. So the oligosaccharides, 3 to 10 monosaccharides joined together. They're high in beans and legumes, right? So you pick your favorite bean, it's going to be high in this sort of medium length carbohydrate. The oligosaccharides are interesting because they aren't digested. In other words, we can chew on them, we swallow them, they make it to our stomach and into our intestine. The oligosaccharides that are intact when they make it into our intestine, there are no specific enzymes to break them down. There is no oligosaccharide aces, basically, right? And so we're missing the enzymes to break them down. So what that means is they'll make it through our digestive tract, through our small intestine, and arrive at the colon, large intestine intact. They haven't been absorbed through the walls of the small intestine. We have these links of glucoses showing up in the large intestine. Yep, bacteria gets excited. They have a bacteria party. They ferment those carbohydrates and they produce a lot of gas. So when somebody asks you, why do I get gassy when I eat beans? It's because of the oligosaccharides. It isn't because of the fiber, even though beans are high in fiber. It's the oligosaccharides making it into the colon. The colon therefore goes, yep, bacteria party, let's have it, a little fiesta, and they ferment those carbohydrates. Byproduct of fermentation is gas. That's a perfect segue into dietary fiber. So dietary fiber is a carbohydrate, but it's an indigestible carbohydrate. So kind of like what we're talking about with the oligosaccharides. So the body doesn't have the ability to break the bonds between the carbohydrates in the fiber, between the monosaccharides in the fiber. And so when we consume foods high in fiber, they go through our digestive tract without getting completely broken down and without being absorbed. So there's two types of fiber. There's insoluble and soluble fiber. And there's a difference between the two and how our body reacts to them. So insoluble fiber, as the title suggests, it's not broken down at all. Insoluble means it just stays as it is. And so there's a couple different types: cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. We find these typically in the skin or in the shell or the outer coating of beans, fruits, vegetables. Insoluble fiber is not fermented by bacteria in the colon. So when insoluble fiber is consumed, and you've all done this, and I know you're looking at your poop now, right? So when it makes it to your colon and leaves your body in poop, it pretty much looks like it did when it went in, right? And so we're looking like apple skin. Apple skin makes it into the colon. Does a bacteria ferment it and break it down? No. So insoluble fiber will enter the body and pretty much leave exactly the way it came in. May change color a little bit, all that kind of good stuff, but it's not affected by our digestive tract really at all. Soluble fiber is different. A couple different types: gum, pectin, mucilage. Those are three types. There's multiple. We typically find these in the meat of vegetables and fruits. And so if we're using the apple skin example, the meat of the apple is going to be where there's some soluble fiber contained. So the difference between soluble fiber and insoluble is that the soluble fiber is fermented by the bacteria in the colon. So it makes it through our small intestine unabsorbed, kind of like the oligosaccharides, right? But when it gets to the large intestine says, wait a second, we can ferment this stuff, and it does. And so the soluble fiber, can also lead to high amounts of gas being produced in the colon because of the fermentation process by bacteria. So here's a graphic even of an apple on the top there, and it shows that, on the skin we find the cellulose, in the meat we find the pectin, so the insoluble and the soluble. There's looks like a kernel of wheat or something right there. With the same type of thing, we have the insoluble fiber on the skin, and the inside on the meat of the grain, there's this soluble fiber. So hopefully, right, you're familiar with, eating fiber is a big deal. We should eat fiber. There's some health benefits, and there absolutely are. And so a few of the benefits of eating dietary fiber. First, it promotes larger stool. And so larger stool, larger volume of poo, basically, right? Because fiber is not being absorbed into the body, it stays in the digestive tract, which means there's going to be more volume, more stuff making it to the colon. That helps stretch and helps exercise the muscles of your digestive tract. And that's an important thing, right? As mostly kinesiology majors that I'm talking to, the use it or lose it principles in play throughout the body. You don't use the muscles of your digestive tract, they're going to weaken, they're going to fail at some point. So consuming a large amount of fiber is important for that. Consuming fiber can lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. It plays a role in helping eliminate some of the bad cholesterol in our body. And so cholesterol is something that appears in our body, or its function in our body is to deal with inflammatory processes. And when we get too much of certain types of cholesterol, especially the low density lipoprotein form of cholesterol, it can cause some cardiovascular issues, increase our risk for cardiovascular disease. Diets high in fiber can lower that levels of LDL cholesterol. That's a good thing. high amounts of fiber in the diet can decrease hemorrhoids and diverticula. Hemorrhoids and diverticula are similar. Hemorrhoids are basically a blowout of a vessel on the inner lining of your anus, and the diverticula is a blowout of a vessel on the outside. And so, because consuming fiber helps keep us regular, it helps keeps our stool moving, we have to basically battle with going to the bathroom less. And so that creates a situation where there's less stress on the vascular system of our lower bowels, and therefore less of a risk of that increased stress, that increased pressure of damaging vessels. And so also, and what's not listed on here is, some of the individuals who consume a lot of fiber, where are we finding fiber? What types of foods? Well, raw fruits and vegetables are probably your best sources. You find it a little bit in some grains. Sure, whole grain products are decently high in fiber. Even beans and stuff. But people who eat a lot of fiber in their diet also have an association, epidemiological research, right, with eating better diets in general, right? So it's like, hey, I'm trying to get more fiber in my diet. What should I do? Oh, you have a nice big raw green salad, right, with some vegetables and stuff on it. Awesome. Those who eat less fiber tend to be eating more processed foods. Processed foods have much, much less fiber than natural foods, generally speaking. The diverticula, just because I mentioned it and I always fly by it, so I've added a graphic. So the diverticula are these sort of segments of a blown out vascular sort of vessel on the outer surface of the colon. So very much like a hemorrhoid. A hemorrhoid would be usually on the inner surface, or at least on the sort of border of the outer surface of the anus. And these diverticula are very much similar, very much a consequence of increased stress while trying to produce bowel movements over time. How much fiber should we be consuming? It varies. Recommendations, 20 to 35 grams of fiber per day, or a recommendation that I like better, because I do counsel athletes that should be eating 5,000 calories a day. Does that 20 to 35 grams apply to small people and large people? Maybe not. So for some of my bigger kids, let's go based off of how many calories you consume. So I like that second recommendation, 10 to 13 grams per 1,000 calories a day. Great recommendation. So if I eat 3,000 calories a day, I should be somewhere between 30 and 40 grams of fiber intake per day. Average American intake is about 16 grams. Not a good sign. It's probably an indication that we eat too much processed food, right? And not enough of the good fruits and veggies and all that good stuff. Consuming too much fiber can be a problem. Fiber is very much like a sponge in a good way, and that's one of the ways it increases the bulk of our stool, or makes our poo bigger, is that it brings water to it, and so it stays really hydrated. But if you don't consume extra water and you do consume a lot of fiber, then you could start getting into trouble. And so it does require extra intake of fluids. We'll talk about this in more detail in the protein and even in the vitamin and mineral discussion, but foods that are high in fiber, the fiber, fiber comes naturally. If you're eating a bell pepper, right, the skin of the bell pepper is attached to the meat. Well, in the meat of the bell pepper, there's some fantastic vitamins and minerals, but sometimes because of that binding of the meat to the fiber and the fiber not getting digested or exposed to those digestive enzymes, sometimes the meat of that fruit or vegetable doesn't get exposed to those enzymes either. And that fiber, basically, the term they use is it binds to them, and therefore those minerals and vitamins don't get absorbed into our body. So sometimes too much fiber, even though you say, oh, I ate all these vitamins and minerals, I did an analysis on my food intake, and I got all these, but it is so high in fiber that you may not absorb all those vitamins and minerals that you consume because of it. So usually not an issue. The development of something called a phytobezoar, one of my favorite words in the world. If any of you are out there who's going to form a rock band, use phytobezoars in the name, and it's going to be awesome. So the development of phytobezoars, and phytobezoars, if you're familiar with like a tumbleweed in the desert, right? Some of you surely have driven through the desert and seen a tumbleweed roll across the highway. Think of a phytobezoar being a tumbleweed in your small intestine. Not a good thing, right? Fiber can start to accumulate and develop a ball, and once that ball gets big enough, that ball of fiber, it gets stuck. And so removal of phytobezoars, there's some medications that can kind of go in there to break it up, kind of like a Drano, or surgery. neither of those two choices is a good one. So, over consuming fiber does have some potential health consequences. I've only met one person who's had one over the many, many years I've been meeting people talking about digestion. So, and this is sort of, again, more of a tangent, but it does happen that, sometimes sometimes children and smaller individuals, especially people who are trying to grow and get adequate nutrition, if you eat fiber, is really filling. It has a very high satiety factor, which means a little bit of fiber makes us feel full based on how many calories we get. And remember, we get 0 calories from fiber. Fiber does not get absorbed and utilized for in metabolism at all. So fiber is a 0-calorie food. So if you eat a lot of fiber, it might offset eating other more nutritious foods. And so in small children who are trying to grow, especially, too much fiber could limit the amount of other good nutrition that they're getting. So things to be mindful of. All right, so last couple slides before we finish this first part of the discussion. So a sort of final category of carbohydrates that are getting a little bit more attention in the health and nutrition world lately are called resistant starches. Resistant starches are pretty cool. They are starches, so we're talking pretty much amylose, maybe not amylopectin so much. They function like soluble fiber, and so they pass through our GI tract without being digested, just like soluble fiber, or maybe like an oligosaccharide, but they're much bigger than oligosaccharides. When resistant starches get to our colon, they do help feed our bacteria, and so they lead to the formation of something called butyrate, which is what the lining of our colon, the cells in our colon, love to use butyrate as a fuel source, as an energy source. So the consumption of resistant starches, which includes insoluble soluble fiber, is really important. And a lot of times, for those of you that take probiotics, you'll hear the term prebiotics, which I mentioned in our digestion talk. Prebiotics are often full of resistant starches, right? Because we know these are foods that make it to the colon to feed the bacteria, make the bacteria happy, might get a little gassy, no big deal. So people who consume resistant starches get that benefit. They also see an improvement in insulin sensitivity. So resistant starches, if we eat foods high in resistant starches, there's a very, very little, if any, blood glucose response, right? Because we're not absorbing any of the glucose from the polysaccharides in that food, we see that over time, people who eat a lot more resistant starches, their insulin sensitivity starts to improve. The body's not having to deal with big sugar rushes. We're going to talk about insulin and all that stuff in the second part of this discussion. And it also helps increase satiety, increase that feeling of fullness. So resistant starches, and again, you're looking at this probably going, this is exactly the same thing that soluble fiber does. You're right. It's just these resistant starches are found in foods, and they're different than fiber. They're not fiber, and they're not oligosaccharides. They're polysaccharides that are pretending to be soluble fiber. How's that? So you can think of them synonymously with soluble fiber, even though molecularly they're quite different. So resistant starches do have 4 different types, and so I want to at least mention these briefly. The type 1 we find naturally in grains, seeds, legumes, those are beans, and they resist digestion primarily because they're bound to the fibrous cell walls of those foods. And so the resistant starches in these types of foods aren't necessarily unique in that they probably could be digested if they're separated. So for processing this food, so for processing a grain product versus eating the grain product whole, that processed grain product, let's say white grain, white flour, no resistant starches there, but a whole grain, whatever, cereals, something, I don't know. There'll probably be a lot more resistant starches if that hasn't been, processed. Type 2, we find in some starchy foods raw potatoes and green unripe bananas. And raw potatoes and unripe bananas have been pretty popular in the nutrition world the last couple of years since the discovery that, these are high in resistant starches. So they're just naturally high in these resistant starches. I'll talk about the green banana as an example. So green bananas, if you've ever eaten one, they're not sweet. They're not sweet at all. As a matter of fact, they're the opposite of sweet. They can be quite bitter. What happens as the banana ripens is that the amylose, the straight chain starches, start to break down, right? The banana is ripening, and through that ripening process, we see the breakdown of the integrity of the carbohydrates in that banana. And as they start to break down, we see the branching of those sugar molecules, making them sweeter and sweeter. So they're getting a little bit smaller and they're getting branched out. And so they start being full of these resistant starches. But as the banana ripens, those resistant starches just become starches, and then they become sugars. And so it has to be green bananas, potatoes uncooked. The third type of resistant starches is amazing to me. So they're formed when certain starchy foods, like potatoes, like rice, like oatmeal — I've been doing some experiments with oatmeal on myself — they're cooked and then cooled. Let's take the potato as an example. We already said the raw potato, super high in resistant starches. When we eat it, yep, very little blood sugar response, mixes the colon, everything happens great. When we cook it, and when we cook things like rice and we cook other foods like oatmeal, those resistant starches get broken down in the cooking process, right? Cooking can very much alter the chemical structure of anything that you're cooking, in this case, carbohydrates. And so when we cook a potato, it changes everything. And potatoes, when they're cooked, have one of the highest, what we call glycemic indexes of all foods. It causes a blood sugar rush like no other. The interesting thing is, if we take that potato and cook it, let's say we boiled the potato, awesome, now you have a boiled potato, let's chuck it back in the fridge and let's let that potato cool. There's a threshold of cooling. It's somewhere around, it's below 40 degrees. So it really needs to be cold. Most people that I know freeze their potatoes. But when you cool these foods down again, the resistant starches reform. Unbelievable, right? It's a crystallization process. It's called retrogradation. So we take a food like a potato, high in resistant starches, cook it, kill the resistant starches, but then, hey, wait a sec, it's not too late. Throw in the fridge, or even better, the freezer. Those resistant starches will reform through this crystallization process called retrogradation, and all of a sudden we have this cooked cold potato that's high in resistant starches. Awesome product. Those of you that like your overnight oats, which is oatmeal cooked in a fridge, cooked, they never get heated up, so they never lose the initial resistant starches that they have. Those are resistant starch bombs, the overnight oats. So fantastic type of food. If you cook your oatmeal and then cool it, it will also gain back some of those resistant starches. So finally, the fourth type is man-made form. You can find supplements that are high in these prebiotics or resistant starch. They're advertised as such. So those are the four versions of resistant starches. This is where you find them. We've already talked about all these sources. So if you want to read up on them, Authority Nutrition has some great information on resistant starches, as does freetheanimal.com. I think we're going to take a little break. I'll see you in part 2.